When triumph becomes expectation, downfall begins in silence. When an empire grows too vast, its cracks widen unseen, and when one man stands against a continent, even legends can break. The empire once seemed invincible. Its armies marched across Europe like thunder, rewriting borders, toppling dynasties, and shaping the world through sheer force of will. But history teaches us that the higher a power rises, the more fragile it becomes. And by 1809, the first tremors of collapse had already begun to whisper beneath the roar of victory. The world did not yet see it, but the decline had started. The turning of the tide does not begin with a roar. It begins with a subtle shift, a moment so quiet, so easily overlooked, that only history, looking backward, can reveal its weight. In the early years of the 19th century, that shift had already begun. The world still trembled under the shadow of an empire that had risen with unstoppable force. But beneath its victories, fault lines were forming. The thunder of triumph had not yet faded, but the winds were changing, weaving uncertainty into the very fabric of power. For years, Europe had watched a single authority sweep across its maps like a storm. Kingdoms that had stood for centuries were humbled. Coalitions forged of fear and desperation crumbled beneath the precision of an army that seemed guided not by chance, but by destiny. But victory breeds expectation, and expectation breeds blindness. The empire believed itself unshakable. It had forgotten how quietly collapse begins. Across Europa, resentment simmered beneath enforced alliances and conquered lands. Nations bled under conscription. Treasuries dried up, and mothers watched their sons vanish into wars that no longer promised glory. What began as a crusade for dominance had become a machine, consuming everything in its path, a machine that even its master could no longer fully control. The first signs of this decay appeared not on distant battlefields, but in the hearts of the people. Soldiers once eager for glory now marched with weary eyes, their pride eroded by endless war. Families long accustomed to sacrifice began to question whether honor could still outweigh grief. Across villages and cities, whispers began to replace cheers. What had once felt like triumph now felt like a heavy, unending burden. But the empire, too consumed by its own momentum, did not hear the whispers. It just marched forward. The turning point did not come from foreign kings, nor from the clash of grand armies, but from the weight of ambition pressing against the limits of reality. The empire had grown too vast to sustain, too vast to manage, too vast to control. Victory had stretched it farther than loyalty could reach, and while it expanded outward, its core began to hollow. Diplomats pretended the alliances were strong, but behind the walls of palaces, resentment simmered. Kings who had once bowed in fear now counted the days until opportunity returned. Nations that had signed treaties did so with clenched teeth. Every handshake was a mask, every oath a delay. The empire, intoxicated by its own dominance, believed obedience was loyalty. It did not see that obedience is often only the silence before rebellion. Yet the clearest sign of the turning tide lay in a single truth. No empire, no matter how brilliant its leader or powerful, its armies can stand forever against the combined weight of Europe. When Europe finally learns to fear defeat more than it fears the conqueror, the year 1809 brought this truth into sharp focus. For the first time in a long time, the empire encountered resistance that did not simply collapse under pressure. Austria, humiliated in earlier wars, rose again. It was not a nation acting from strength, but from desperation, and desperation is a force more dangerous than power. The Austrian army was battered, outmatched, and imperfect, yet it fought with the fury of a nation refusing to die quietly. Each battle they lost cost the empire more than it gained. Victories continued, but the price was changing. Every triumph left deeper wounds, using up energy that could not be replaced. Perhaps the most defining element of this shift was not the battles themselves, but what they represented. The empire was no longer feared as it once had been. Europe had learned that giants could bleed, and once that belief takes hold, even the strongest power faces a new kind of enemy. The empire's armies marched into Austria expecting another swift conquest. What they found instead was a war of attrition that eroded confidence. Streets once filled with cheering crowds now greeted soldiers with cold eyes. Towns emptied before the army arrived, not out of AO, but out of resentment. Supplies became harder to acquire. Local resistance quiet, decentralized, persistent grew like roots, breaking apart stone. For every victory on the open field, there were a dozen tiny defeats in the shadows. Saboteurs cutting supply lines, villages hiding food, farmers refusing cooperation. None of these acts could defeat an empire, but together they weakened it. It was in Spain, however, that the turning tide revealed itself in full, brutal clarity. The first fractures of the empire appeared here. What was meant to be a swift occupation exploded into a brutal, unending struggle. Villagers, priests, farmers, and merchants rose not as soldiers, but as shadows, striking from forests, hills, alleys, and ruins. The Peninsular War drained men, gold, and confidence. The war turned the land into a graveyard of certainty, revealing a truth the empire had long refused to see. Resistance born from desperation is stronger than armies born from duty. Each loss in Spain echoed across Europe, whispering a new truth. The empire could be fortanned, more importantly. It could be resisted by ordinary people. And while Spain bled the empire dry, the greatest blow lay farther east. Russia vast, unforgiving, unyielding. The march toward Moscow was supposed to end a rival once and for all. Instead, it became the march that broke an empire. The cold devoured soldiers faster than bullets ever could. Hunger replaced discipline. Desperation replaced strategy. And the retreat would be remembered as one of the greatest catastrophes in military history. An army that had once conquered nations was reduced to shadows stumbling through snow. Europe sensed weakness. Enemies once defeated rose again. Allies once loyal slipped away. Kingdoms united not out of friendship, but out of necessity, for the storm that had once terrified them now seemed ready to break. From Leipzig to the gates of Paris, the tide turned with relentless force. Each loss was more than a battle. It was a piece of the empire, tearing away, and through it all, the weight of ambition pressed heavier than ever. Choices once sharp and decisive became clouded by exhaustion and fear. The world that had once bowed now stood defiantly against him. The most devastating shift, however, lay deeper, almost invisible, a change in the empire's own nature. What had once been lean, efficient, and fiercely strategic began to bloat under the weight of its own accomplishments. Bureaucracy grew. Communication faltered. Generals once chosen for brilliance were replaced by those chosen for loyalty. Orders moved slower. Decisions became clouded. The machine that had once operated with ruthless precision now hesitated where it once acted. Victories became harder. Losses felt heavier. The fall was no single event. It was a slow, grinding collapse, a tightening circle of miscalculation, resistance, and inevitability. This is the story of 1809 to 1814, not merely the fall of armies, but the unraveling of a legend, a reminder that even the greatest force in Europe could not outrun the consequences of its own ambition. And so, an empire built on victory began to die by it. Every conquest created a new border to defend, a new population to control, a new enemy waiting in the shadows. The very success that defined the empire became the engine of its own destruction, proving that the brightest flames often burn out the fastest, leaving behind only the cold, hard lessons of history. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into the turning points of history. We'll see you next time. As the years progressed, The empire's leaders found themselves confronting a force they had long underestimated: time. Time that wore down armies. Time that exhausted treasuries. Time that transformed admiration into resentment. And time that turned the brightest strategist into a man fighting shadows of his own past victories. The turning of the tide became undeniable when the empire realized its enemies no longer feared it. Fear had been its greatest weapon. More powerful than any cannon. More swift than any cavalry. Without fear, its victories felt empty. Without fear, its authority faltered. Without fear, its dominion began to tremble. The empire still possessed unmatched strength, but strength without momentum is like a blade in a display case, sharp, yet no longer decisive. Europe sensed this. Nations waited. Some prepared quietly. Others openly defied. The tide did not rush in. It inched forward, gradual and relentless, and with each inch, the empire lost something it could never regain. For the first time, defeat felt possible. Not imminent, not certain, but possible. And when an empire built on triumph begins to imagine defeat, even only in whispers, the fall has already begun. The brilliance that once inspired or now sparked anxiety. Decisions once seen as daring were now questioned as reckless. The conquests that once united the empire now strained it. The commander who had once dominated Europe now faced a continent slowly awakening from fear. What began as a subtle shift had grown into an unstoppable current. The tide had turned, and though the empire still stood tall, the foundations beneath its feet were beginning to crack. The storm of downfall was coming, and history would soon witness how even the greatest power can crumble when its ambition outgrows its strength. And as those cracks widened, the weight of an empire stretched beyond its own reach began to make itself felt in every corner of the continent. Once, the armies had seemed to glide across Europe with the inevitability of nightfall, precise and unstoppable. But now, the vastness they had created was becoming their greatest adversary. The empire no longer ruled a nation. It ruled a patchwork of subdued peoples, exhausted economies, wounded kingdoms, coerced allies, and territories held together not by loyalty, but by pressure. And pressure, no matter how forceful, weakens what it cannot truly bind. From the Iberian Peninsula to the heart of Central Europe, the strain became unmistakable. Territories seized in triumph now demanded resources. Soldiers, administrators, an endless attentiate returned little but resentment. Each new land added to the empire meant more borders to defend, more resistance to suppress, more uprisings to fear. What had once been a source of pride had become a labyrinth of obligations. Every victory chained the empire tighter to an expanding burden. It was as if conquest had turned into a weight pressing down on its own foundations. The wars that followed revealed this truth with merciless clarity. In Spain, the struggle no longer resembled conventional warfare. It had descended into a brutal, grinding conflict where an unseen resistance bled armies dry. The empire's legions could take cities, but they could not hold their spirit. Every village became a battlefield, every road a trap, every shadow a potential enemy. What should have been a brief campaign became a furnace that consumed tens of thousands. Supplies vanished, morale withered, and frustration hardened into dread. For the first time, soldiers felt they were fighting not to win, but merely to survive. Spain was not a war. It was a warning. But the warning was not heeded, for the machinery of ambition could not slow. An empire built on momentum cannot suddenly become still without risking collapse. So it pushed forward, clinging to the belief that one decisive blow elsewhere would compensate for the bleeding in the west. Eyes turned toward the east, a land so vast, so cold, so unyielding that any march toward it required not courage, but denial. Denial of distance, denial of climate, denial of history itself. And yet, The empire advanced. The road stretched endlessly across plains that swallowed sound. Villages appeared like ghosts, abandoned before the armies had even arrived. The land did not resist at first, but in that retreat lurked danger more lethal than any opposing force. Supplies dwindled. Horses weakened. Soldiers grew restless under skies that offered no shelter, no sign of victory, only an emptiness that felt like warning. The empire, used to forcing the world to its will, found itself negotiating with a landscape that refused to bend. Summer passait, and autumn crept in with its deceptive calm. Then came the cold. The cold descended like an assassin, silent, merciless, unavoidable. It pierced through layers of cloth, split flesh, froze breath, and shattered resolve. What the empire had feared least, nature now became the most formidable enemy it had ever faced. Food ran out. Fires failed. Boots cracked. Weapons rusted. Thousands collapsed along the frozen roads, not from battle, but from the simple impossibility of continuing. Yet still the march pressed on. The goal lay ahead, shimmering in the distance like a promise. But when the armies arrived, they found not triumph, but emptiness. The city that had been meant to signal victory instead stood silent, stripped of supplies, stripped of warmth, stripped of surrender. Flames rose from its buildings, turning hope into smoke. A winter wind swept through its streets, reminding every soldier that the true battle had nothing to do with enemies. It was against time, hunger, and the unforgiving hand of the season. There was no choice but to retreat. The retreat became legend not for its strategy, but for its suffering. Men who had crossed half a continent now struggled simply to put one foot before the other. Horses dropped where they stood. Artillery, once symbols of conquest, were abandoned in snowdrifts. Units dissolved. Discipline faded. The empire's proud formations disintegrated into scattered remnants, moving through a white abyss. The land offered no mercy. Wolves trailed the columns. Ice claimed the fallen. Every mile became a grave. By the time the survivors stumbled back across the borders, they were no longer an army. They were fragments of one. The myth of invincibility had shattered upon the frozen plains. Europe felt the tremor. Kings who had once trembled now found courage. Nations that had bowed now stirred. The empire's enemies sensed that the giant, though still standing, had been wounded. And in war, a wounded giant is more vulnerable than a fallen one, for the scent of weakness draws adversaries from every direction. The first two seized the moment where those who had suffered longest. They rekindled armies, revived alliances, whispered into the ears of rivals that the time to rise had come. Treaties, once signed out of fear, were renounced. Hidden coalitions emerged into the open. Where once there had been disunity, now there was purpose. To resist, to push back, to reclaim what had been lost. And behind every decision lay a simple belief the empire could be beaten. But the empire could not retreat into caution. It could not admit exhaustion, for doing so would invite collapse. Vast territories still demanded occupation. Armies had to be rebuilt, revolts had to be quelled, borders had to be defended, and above all, the world had to see the empire remain unshaken. The machinery of war ramped up once again, draining treasuries already bleeding gold, pulling new recruits from towns already mourning their sons. The strain was visible everywhere. Fields lay untended, streets filled with widows and children, factories strained to meet endless demands. The countryside bore scars of requisition and shortages. Even in the heart of the empire, where prosperity had once thrived, signs of fatigue spread like cracks in a great monument. The empire's expansion had outpaced its resources. It was like a living creature forced to grow beyond what its bones could support. Diplomacy, once an instrument of control, now struggled against shifting loyalties. Old allies wavered, former enemies found common cause. Borders once secure grew porous. Every direction required defense, but no direction offered relief. Thanks for watching. If you want to dive deeper into the rise and fall of great powers, be sure to subscribe for more. See you next time. The overextension became undeniable during the wars that followed. Armies still marched, but they marched slower, fought harder, and suffered deeper. The brilliance that had once guided campaigns now faltered beneath the weight of endless fronts. Battles were won, but with casualties the victories could no longer justify. The empire no longer shaped the continent. The continent was beginning to shape the empire. Then came the rising storm from the north, the resurgence from the east, and the defiance from Central Europe, all gathering like clouds around a once dominant sun. What had been a world cowed by a single force now became a world united by a shared desire to break free. Every mile of land the empire held became a liability. Every conquered people became a potential enemy. Every ally became a burden, and every victory cost more than it returned. The empire found itself fighting not one war, but a dozen at once. Wars of rebellion, attrition, supply, weather, diplomacy, and pure exhaustion. And perhaps the most devastating of all was the internal struggle to maintain control, discipline, and confidence in a machine now creaking under the strain of its own vastness. What had been built for conquest was now forced into survival, and survival demanded something the empire no longer possessed: restraint. But restraint was impossible, for weakness could not be shown. So it continued onward, deeper into battles that offered no reward, only delay. The center of power, once so assured, now found itself pulled in every direction, unable to choose where to stand firm and where to yield. Momentum had become the enemy, and so the empire, stretched thin across the continent, began to fracture beneath the weight of its own ambition, its own reach, its own belief that domination could be maintained without limit. The overextension that once seemed like strength was now revealed as the very force that would lead it toward decline. The collapse did not arrive as a single shattering moment. It came as a steady tightening of forces around a man who once shaped the destiny of nations with a gesture. The world that had once trembled at the thunder of his armies had now unified in their determination to stop the storm he had unleashed. And as he reeled from the disaster in the east, the continent sensed a shift, a strange and unfamiliar weakness creeping into the very heart of the empire. It was a weakness not of body, but of circumstance, of the crushing reality that even giants bleed when the world turns against them. He returned from the frozen plains, not to applause, but to an empire staggering under exhaustion. Towns whispered of losses, mothers wailed at doors left forever empty, and ministers studied maps with a dread they dared not voice. The aura of invincibility that once shielded him had cracked, and every monarch who once bowed or trembled now felt courage creeping back into their bones. They had seen the winter do what they could not, and so, one by one, they chose their moment. Prussia was the first to strike, sensing the weakness with a predator's instinct. Once humiliated, once forced to bend, it rose again with the ferocity of a nation reborn. Armies that had once scattered before him now marched with renewed determination, fueled by revenge and a desire to reclaim honor lost. Their war songs carried across the fields, echoing with a new defiance. They were no longer afraid. Austria followed cautiously at first, then with full resolve. It had seen empires rise and fall for centuries, and it recognized the signs of a power stretched thin. Diplomats who once negotiated from shadows now bargained with allies openly, forming coalitions that once would have been unthinkable. The empire he had built was now surrounded not by trembling rivals, but by confident adversaries. And far to the north, another giant stirred. Russia, having survived the flames and frost of its own scorched homeland, now marched westward with vengeance burning hot. Its soldiers, hardened by the cruelty of winter, moved with brutal determination. They advanced not merely to reclaim territory, but to ensure the man who had brought suffering to their gates would never regain his former strength. Yet even while the storm gathered, he refused to retreat into the safety of resignation. The Empire's armies were shadows of what they once were, but his will remained unbroken. He raised new forces, young men barely grown, veterans patched together from remnants of shattered units, and officers hardened by a decade of constant war. They looked to him and still saw the figure who had once redrawn the map of Europe. And even if the world doubted, they believed it. They always had. He moved swiftly, assembling what strength remained, determined to strike before the coalition could fully encircle him. Battles erupted across Germany, Lutzen, Bautzen, Dresden, places whose names history would remember as the desperate heartbeat of an empire fighting against time itself. And in those moments, flashes of the old brilliance returned. Maneuvers sharp as lightning, decisions so swift they stunned even his enemies. Victories that seemed to whisper that perhaps the tide could be forced back again, if only for a moment. But moments are not enough to hold an empire together. Every triumph came at a cost the shrinking state could no longer afford. Each victory consumed lives faster than they could be replaced. Each battle weakened the frail unity of allies who had been forced into loyalty rather than choosing it. And all the while, the coalition armies grew larger, fed by nations who had tasted hope. The turning point arrived at Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, a name earned not by poetry, but by sheer scale. The world seemed to converge on a single field, hundreds of thousands of soldiers pressed into an inferno of smoke and steel. 4 days, the struggle raged. Cannon thundered until the ground quaked. Muskets flashed in endless waves. Cities burned, rivers clogged with the fallen. And in the center of it all, he fought with the stubborn defiance of a man who refused to accept that time itself had turned against him. But even genius cannot overcome the weight of entire continents united in purpose. One ally after another faltered or betrayed him. Saxony, long loyal, turned in the very midst of battle. Bridges collapsed too soon or too late. Signals were misread. Orders were delayed. And as the chaos mounted, the realization dawned. He was no longer fighting armies, he was fighting the momentum of history itself. He withdrew, not in disgrace, but in grim necessity. Yet the retreat from Leipzig marked more than a lost battle. It marked the unraveling of the empire's grip on Europe. Kingdoms defected. Territories rose in rebellion. The confederation that once crowned his influence disintegrated almost overnight. Each defection was like a thread snapping from an already strained tapestry, leaving the fabric of the empire increasingly bare. Still he resisted. Still he strategized. Still he marched. But now he marched not toward conquest, but toward survival. France awaited him with a mixture of faith and fear. The people remembered his glory, yet they also felt the tightening vice of war pressing upon their homes. Supplies dwindled, treasuries drained, and hope became a fragile thing to carry. The coalition pressed forward relentlessly. They crossed borders with the might of nations, convinced they must finish what they started. And so began the campaign of 1814, a final crucible. A desperate attempt to hold the heartland against overwhelming force. It was here, in the fields and towns of his own homeland, that he fought with a brilliance no historian could deny. With small, weary armies, he delivered blows that would have shattered larger foes had time and resources been on his side. He moved like a man possessed, darting across the map with astonishing speed, striking with the precision of a master who knew every nuance of the battlefield. But war is not won by genius alone. Numbers matter, supplies matter, the will of a nation matters, and France, battered and bleeding, no longer had enough to support the weight placed upon it. Cities fell. Allies broke. The coalition advanced from every direction, and for the first time, enemy boots marched toward Paris. Thank you for watching. If you found this story of resilience and collapse fascinating, please like the video and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most pivotal moments. See you next time. Fear was spreading through the city like a wildfire. Inside the halls of power, leaders debated. In the war rooms, generals argued. And among the ordinary citizens, everyone was preparing for the worst. He was racing toward the capital with all the urgency that desperation can create. But fate was moving even faster. Paris surrendered before he could ever reach it. When the news finally caught up to him, it struck like a physical blow, more painful than any defeat he had ever suffered on a battlefield. For an empire built on lightning-fast decisiveness, this single moment was utterly paramount. And just like that, as the coalition leaders marched into Paris in triumph, the fate of his entire empire was sealed, not in glorious battle, but in quiet back rooms, and with hurried signatures on pieces of paper. His marshals, the men who had been the very pillars of his power, now stood before him, urging him to accept what was inevitable. These were men worn down by years and years of constant war. They yearned for peace, for safety, and for the families they had been separated from for so long. They had followed him loyally across scorching deserts, over treacherous mountains, and through frozen hells. But now, they could no longer carry the burden. Their loyalty had once been immense, but their strength was finally gone. He was now facing a choice he had never, ever imagined he would have to make. He could cling to his fading empire and plunge France into a bloody civil war, letting it burn to the ground. Or he could step aside, sparing the land he loved from being torn apart under the boots of foreign armies. And though the fire of defiance still burned hot within him, reality had become an unyielding, unbreakable force. So, he made a decision that would echo louder than any victory or any defeat he had ever known. He relinquished his throne. He wasn't brought down by an enemy's blade, but by the unbearable truth of exhaustion, of betrayal, and the relentless march of a united opposition that had finally cornered him. The man who once ruled nearly all of Europe was now stripped of his power, a prisoner to be exiled to a distant, tiny island. He would be watched over by the very nations he had once humbled and brought to their knees. But what makes the end of this story truly remarkable isn't just the fall itself. History is filled with fallen leaders. What sets this tale apart is the lingering presence of a force that refused to die, even in total isolation. Because even though the world believed it had finally contained him, and even as monarchs and kings congratulated themselves on restoring the old balance of power, they had forgotten one crucial lesson. Legends do not fade quietly into the night. They wait. They measure. They endure. And somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, on a lonely island surrounded by restless waves, a man stood staring back toward the mainland. In his eyes was a fire that exiler could never, ever extinguish. His downfall wasn't defined by a single, crushing defeat on the battlefield. It was more like the slow, steady unwinding of a colossal force that had once reshaped an entire continent. What had begun as a swift march of ambition had turned into a desperate marathon of survival. And what once seemed completely invincible grew fragile and vulnerable under the sheer weight of its own incredible magnitude. The tide that had carried him to the astonishing heights of glory was now receding, revealing a simple truth. Even the greatest powers cannot escape the consequences of ceaseless, unending struggle. From the sun-scorched plains of Spain to the frozen wastelands of the East, from the thunderous cannons at the Battle of Leipzig to the final desperate struggles on his own homeland, the collapse of his empire revealed something far more profound than just military defeat. It showed the absolute limits of human endurance. It showed the fragility of alliances that are built on fear rather than trust. And it showed the inevitability of resistance when nations are pushed far beyond their breaking point. As the circle of his enemies closed in around him, the man at the center found himself facing not only the combined armies of Europe, but also the echoes of his own unyielding, relentless ambition. Yet, even in that moment of total surrender, his legacy did not crumble with the throne he gave up. History doesn't measure a life solely by its downfall. It measures it by the impact it leaves carved across the face of time. His rise had been astonishing. His rule had been transformative. And his fall, though utterly devastating, only served to deepen the legend. Exile may have removed him from the map, but it could never erase the imprint he had left on a world that was forever altered by his presence. The empire that had once stretched across Europe had collapsed, its glory had dimmed, and its ruler had been cast into isolation. But the story didn't end with the ships that carried him away to that remote island. It lingered. It lived on in the memories of the soldiers who still spoke his name with a quiet reverence. It remained in the hearts of nations that had been reshaped by his wars. And it persisted in the restless whisper of a world that sensed, deep down, that the final chapter had not yet been written. Because even as the entire continent celebrated his defeat, far beyond their reach, a man waited, and the world would soon learn that some legacies simply refuse to fade. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to explore more incredible moments from history, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We'll see you in the next one.